Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about how this week has been a game changer. Let's get started. This past week has been nothing short of game-changing. So this week's episode is going to be filled with everything that's happened this week, and it's been huge. For those of you who have not heard our episode 2 episodes ago, Operation Gideon's Chariots Explained, I would suggest that you might want to go and listen to that episode, maybe after this, to get a little more background on what I'm going to be talking about. But in that episode, I said multiple times that the operation that Israel is doing right now was game-changing, and we are seeing it in action in front of our own eyes. This past week has proven how game-changing it is. But let's start from the beginning. Just as a reminder for those who haven't yet heard that episode, Israel was going to dismantle the old form of getting aid to the people of Gaza in this Gideon's Chariot operation by creating a safe zone that they will directly hand out aid without using the UN. For long-time listeners, you know that the UN, through UNRWA, the Palestinian Refugee Organization, has been working hand-in-hand with Hamas. There hasn't even been a lot of pushback to that claim. It's pretty much proven, whether it's them taking part in October 7th directly, them hoarding aid, them not getting aid to the people. They are complicit because they are Hamas. And so as part of this game-changing move that Israel has been doing, they removed the UN entirely from the aid situation, and it is paying off big time. And there are 2 ways we know that this is working, and I'll explain them both to you. Over the last week, as long as this aid has been handed out by Israel and in partnership with the United States, the Gazan people have been flooding to these aid resource centers and actually getting food. I know that seems crazy that people would go to an aid station and receive aid, but in Gaza, that actually is crazy. That doesn't happen normally under the UN, and I'll explain why in a minute. But the Israeli army has been getting aid into the area that is now being handed out by the IDF mixed with this Gaza American volunteer group. And using this new system that the Israelis invented, over 2 million packages have been handed out to Gazans without any concerns and any issues. We have been hearing since the beginning of this conflict, ironically even before the Israelis ever went into Gaza, that there was a famine and starvation and people had no food, and now they're getting their food. So the question is, why weren't they getting the food before? Is it that Israel wasn't handing trucks over before? It seems like the same amount of trucks, if not even slightly less, are going in now, but more people are getting their aid. So where was the aid going? And thankfully, we know where the aid was going because the Gazans helped us find it. Early this past week, reports and videos were coming out of the Gazan people who are no longer afraid of Hamas thanks to Israel taking them all out and them hiding underground. The Gazan people broke into a UN/Hamas food warehouse that is so big I can't even explain it to you, filled nearly to the roof with aid. Flour and food, all of the things that they had been keeping from the people of Gaza while they claimed a mass starvation was happening. Let me just repeat that. A UN warehouse was filled with food while claiming at the same time that there's a mass starvation happening. And the only way for the Gazan people to get that aid was to break into a UN warehouse to go and steal it. And this answers the earlier question. Why is the UN not getting aid to the people? And that is because they are saving it for Hamas. Because the UNRWA is a wing of Hamas at this point. And there's a very strategic reason why Hamas, through the UN, is not handing out that aid. Because that aid, A, needs to feed their people so they can keep fighting. But B, needs to be sold to the people at extremely high prices in order to fund their activities. And I don't remember if I mentioned this on our previous podcast, but we do know that Hamas is unable to pay their fighters because they have been unable to steal aid for the last couple of months and cannot sell it to their people and therefore have no money to pay their fighters. So the fact that not only does Hamas not get aid that they can steal anymore in order to sell to pay their fighters, but also the people of Gaza are now getting food, which to Hamas is a terrible thing. Hamas can't have these people eating food and looking like they're healthy. That goes against all of their propaganda. And we saw specifically Hamas come out and try and stop their people from eating. At first, they attempted to stop the people through threats. They were sending out information and people to tell any person who eats Israeli food from the aid station will be in big trouble. And Hamas really thought that this would actually work. I guess they didn't really think that their people would go against them or not fear them. But unfortunately for Hamas, thanks to the IDF, the Hamas members are no longer a threat and people are no longer afraid of them. So they defied Hamas's orders and went and got aid anyway. Many of whom, after the fact, were seen on video saying thank you to the IDF and thank you to the United States. Even the biased Al Jazeera was asking questions of people who just got aid, trying to paint it as a bad thing, only to have a person say thank you, Donald Trump, and they cut away really quickly from that interview. So Hamas had to ramp it up a notch. They tried to set up their own aid stations. Ironically, because they hadn't been handing out aid for this long, they decided that the only way to counter handing out aid by the US and Israel is to actually hand out the aid you've never been handing out this entire time. Although that didn't work for them either. And eventually they had to resort to killing people, like the 5 people they killed trying to steal the aid from the UN warehouse, which I'm sure you never heard about on the news. There was also attempts to kill people who were heading to the aid station in order to stop them from going to the aid station and threaten anybody else who tried. But unfortunately for Hamas, the people didn't care. They were no longer afraid of Hamas, and they were going to go get their aid because they needed and wanted their aid, and it was available. And now it seems that Hamas has lost entire control over the Gaza area. They may technically be in charge, but people are no longer fearing them. People are now getting the aid they need and they desire from Israel, and the people are speaking out against Hamas. Hamas, according to most reports, has completely lost control of Gaza. And what is most amazing about that statement is the fact how many times we heard from the international community, you will never be able to remove Hamas from power in Gaza, no matter how much you bomb your way out of this situation. And meanwhile, it seems like they have lost their power. They are officially no longer in control. That is not to say that every Hamas member is gone and that they're not still at risk of killing other people, but clearly they have lost control. So it is not surprising that we have seen a very hard pressure campaign from the Western media. And it's not to support the handing out of aid to Gazans. Of course not. We would never do that. It is to pressure the Israelis to stop handing aid to Gazans? Yep, that's right. That is what the Western media has spent the last 3 or 4 days trying to push. Now, I'm not sure if this is a willful thing that they're doing, or if this is just something that they're not realizing they're pushing Hamas talking points. But Hamas has been in a full court press to try and get their fake narrative out to the Western world. Because things are working so well, and because they are losing control, they're trying to paint the Israeli aid situation as bad, despite all of the clear evidence it's working. The first attempt at this was on the first day when the Israelis opened up this aid station. The people were so excited / eager to get their aid that they kind of ransacked the place, and the American volunteers kind of backed off and let them take whatever they wanted with no order, which Hamas then put out into the media that it's a free-for-all and that people are being shot, and the Israelis had to shoot up into the air in order to regain control of the area, which of course was seen as a horrible day and a horrible event and clearly proof that this isn't working, according to Hamas propaganda. Meanwhile, when Hamas steals trucks and shoots people, or 5 people die because Hamas doesn't want them stealing from their aid station, that's not a sign that their system doesn't work. And you won't even hear about that in the media. But Israel was able to solve this problem pretty quickly and easily when the next day they opened their aid stations, this time with lineups and stanchions and ways to divide the crowd in order to create order and less chaos. But Hamas couldn't live with this, so they immediately went into their social media and tried to suggest that these lineups of people waiting for aid in nice single-file lines, and compared it to Jewish people in Auschwitz behind barbed wired fence in order to go to a death camp. And they decided that this was an exact comparison. They're one and the same. People waiting for aid in line and people forcibly being put into a line in order to walk to a death camp. And sadly, I hate to say it kind of worked for some of those idiots online. But luckily for most people, it didn't, and the mainstream media never picked this up. But when that story wasn't working for the narrative to hate on Israel for the aid they're handing out, they had to take it up a notch. And what came out a few days later is that apparently Israel slaughtered 30 people waiting for aid at the aid station. Apparently a massacre, they're calling it. The funny part about this supposed massacre is that it literally never happened. Not a single shot was fired. Hamas, in an attempt to delegitimize Israel and try and show that this isn't working, as they had tried earlier, claimed that 30 people were murdered by the Israelis trying to get aid at the aid station. Meanwhile, after CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and all of the mainstream media posted these on their websites and on television, talked about it nonstop, turns out that the closed circuit television recordings that was put out by the American group that does the aid stations shows at that time, literally nothing happened. It's people just picking up aid and walking away. Not a single gunshot, not a single person running. It was totally normal. It was a completely fictional story that made its way from Hamas to the Western media without a single person even fact-checking. A short time later, the IDF released drone footage from the area, which was well away from the aid station, but it showed two masked men who clearly were not IDF soldiers shooting at people walking towards the aid station, two of which were killed. This was yet another attempt by Hamas to stop the people from going to the aid station and getting aid. And yet, Hamas then kills somebody. Hamas then tells its news organizations, BBC, CNN, that a massacre happened, and by the way, it was the Israelis who did it, and the international media just puts it out there. It is insane to me that this is still happening after this amount of time, and how many fake stories have come out and prove that they don't fact-check anything that comes from Hamas. And they're still doing it. What is really most telling about the fact that the aid stations are working is the fact that in the most recent attempt at ceasefires, which I'll talk about in a second, one of Hamas's purposeful sticking points that they need the UN to be in charge of aid once again. If and when there's a ceasefire, the Israelis who have set up this Israeli-American situation, all of them go away, and the UN will go back to handing out aid, which we clearly know has gone so well so far. So why is Hamas wanting so desperately for the UN to take over the aid situation and go back to the way it was before? Because obviously it was working for Hamas before, not for the people. And they desperately need this to stop. But let's talk a little bit about the ceasefire situation, because that is something that happened this week. And it is definitely something that's been on my mind since the beginning of the week. I'll cut to the chase and just let you know, if you don't already know, that the ceasefire deal that was proposed by the US, that was accepted by Israel, was rejected by Hamas. They said no, but, and then put a whole bunch of random things that the negotiator, Steve Witkoff, said were, quote, going backwards. The ceasefire deal that was rejected was 60 days of ceasefire, aid to go in through the UN, unfortunately. The IDF would have to pull back their people from all the land that they had taken, just like in previous ceasefires. And in return, Hamas would have to give up 10 living hostages and 18 dead bodies. And obviously no ceasefire deal is without the 250 terrorists getting out of jail, because why not? One of the main sticking points was that Hamas wanted the ability to allow the ceasefire to continue as long as they wanted it to, and that Israel wouldn't be allowed to go into war if the ceasefire ended and the next round of negotiations didn't happen. Kind of like the last time we had a ceasefire. They also, apparently, were wanting a 7-year ceasefire, not 60 days, because I guess that's how long they think it would take them to rebuild and to regain control over their people so they can stay in power and continue to rule Gaza. Israel, who agreed to the original plan, which was 60 days and the ability to start the war again if no further negotiations took place, rejected the 7-year ceasefire. Israel reserves the right to continue this war to end Hamas as long as Hamas is not willing to give up the power themselves. Something they could literally do right now if they wanted to. They can get their things, they can go to Turkey with the rest of their leadership, and the Gazans could have a much better life. If I could be honest, obviously I know Israel is not going to agree to a 7-year ceasefire, and that was stupid and wishful thinking of Hamas that they can continue to rule. But I struggled all week, like many, with this whole ceasefire situation. Obviously, getting those 10 living hostages home is important and is so crucial. The 18 dead bodies that they've been holding would give so much peace to their family members to finally be able to put their people to rest. And that is so important. I'm sure that our soldiers need a nice break. Very, very important to have a 60-day ceasefire for that reason. However, I'll be honest, I struggle with the idea of accepting a 60-day ceasefire because it'll leave the other hostages who are currently living in terrible conditions for another 60 days for sure until the next round of ceasefire talks, if there is any. So you're condemning those people to, at minimum, another 60 days in torture. Some people may think that I'm crazy for saying this, especially those people who claim I'm some sort of anti-Gazan, anti-Palestinian Arab kind of person. But my biggest fear from this ceasefire deal would be what happens to the people of Gaza during those 60 days. Because we've seen what happens when Hamas comes out of their holes and people were going against them and how much trouble they were in. And now we've seen masses of people not only protesting, but openly going against Hamas in order to go get aid from Israel and the US. And all I can think about is if Hamas has a ceasefire, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to go after all of those Gazans who went against them. And it is going to be a slaughter like we have never seen before in order to maintain or regain control over Gaza that they have lost. When speaking to a friend of mine, I even brought this up and said, I feel that this is a death sentence to the people of Gaza. If we were to pull our troops out right now for 60 days, only to allow Hamas to come out of their holes and regain power, we know what that means to the people of Gaza. That is mass killings. That is tortures. That is putting people in jail. All of those people who finally have had a voice and been able to go against Hamas, all are going to be punished for going against Hamas. And this will undo all of the work that the IDF has done in order to give them that freedom, in order to get rid of Hamas. All of the IDF lives lost. For what? For nothing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that the people of Gaza all of a sudden love Israel and love the United States. I'm not saying that at all. As I've said on previous podcasts, they just kind of go along with whatever's best for them in this moment. And right now, in this moment, Israel is doing them good by giving them aid. And so they're accepting it. But the minute that Hamas comes back into power and starts using their weapons and their threats, sure enough, people are going to go back to supporting Hamas. Or at minimum, just staying quiet and allowing Hamas to continue ruling. So I said to this friend that if Israel was to accept this ceasefire and it actually went through, would it be somewhat selfish of us to get our 10 people back, which is great and fantastic, but then we're sentencing the people of Gaza to death in order to get our people back? I know it may sound crazy to say, but it almost seems like the more moral thing to do as the Israeli army is to not leave the people of Gaza there to die at the hands of Hamas. In the end, thank goodness I am not the person who has to make these extremely tough decisions of whether to ceasefire or not. Whether to get back 10 hostages or 20 hostages in return for how many prisoners, and if we should care about the Hamas people coming back into power only to kill their own people. These are crazy decisions that have to be made, and Israel chose to accept the ceasefire deal. Hamas didn't. And I'm kind of hopeful that the longer this ceasefire doesn't get made, and Hamas holds out for some crazy, ridiculous idea like the permanent end of conflict or 7-year ceasefire, the more that Israel can do in order to get back their people without having to make a deal, without having to hand back 250 plus terrorists. They can force Hamas into submission, as we see Hamas at its weakest it's ever been in its history. The longer that Israel is doing the right thing, handing out aid, making sure it's getting to the people, and cutting the UN and Hamas out, the weaker Hamas gets, and the less likely they are to come back. But one thing that is absolutely clear from this past week is that we can see that Hamas, the liberal media, the world as a whole, is currently inadvertently admitting to this fact, that this past week and everything Israel has been doing for this last week has been an absolute game changer. And hopefully nothing will derail this progress, especially Hamas propaganda. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.